Hello, everyone, and welcome to this technical or analytical session of this international seminar on Central Asia, a vision for peace, partnership, and development. We just concluded our inaugural or flagship session with His Excellency Mr. Dilshod Akatov, Ambassador of Uzbekistan to India. Now, in this very interesting technical session, we have some of the leading experts from across the world. Let me invite our first speaker for this session, Dr. Jennifer B Murtaza, non-resident senior fellow, Atlantic Council and Director, Center for Governance and Markets. She's the president-elect of the Central Eurasian Studies Society. She's an associate professor, Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. So without further ado, let me invite Dr. Jennifer to deliver her address.
Thank you very much. This is a very important topic, and I'm really delighted to be invited by colleagues at the Tillotoma Foundation to discuss this important topic among such esteemed guests. So thank you so much for the opportunity. It's really an enormous honor and pleasure to be here with you today. This is a really vital time to be discussing peace, partnership, and development in Central Asia, especially as it relates to Central Asia, as it relates to its neighbors in South Asia. And this is a very important time. There are really important changes happening in Central Asia that can really help elevate its role in the region and also help it promote peace. As many of you know, the US is withdrawing its troops from Afghanistan in the coming months. And for many in Central Asia, and especially as it relates to South Asia, this really represents both a risk and an opportunity. As we all know, there's enormous concern about what this withdrawal will do for Afghanistan from a security perspective. Many in Afghanistan are quite rightly concerned about what will happen next. But this uncertainty also carries with it possibilities that peace can be achieved. And despite the fact that this war continues, parties are now speaking to one another in ways that has not happened in the past. And especially over the past 20 years, these parties really haven't dealt with one another. So I'm under no illusion that this will be easy, but there really are important foundations that have been set over recent months and years that could create incentives for these different parties to deal with one another to promote peace. Now, how does this deal with the issues of Central Asia? Well, I think what's happening in Afghanistan and the changing security dynamics in Afghanistan are really shaping Central Asian internal dynamics and external ones. So what's happening in Central Asia is also affecting dynamics within Afghanistan as well. And I want to be very clear that I consider Afghanistan to be part of Central Asia. And so there's greater momentum towards regional cooperation in Central Asia than there had been for many years in the past. For decades, we know about projects such as TAPI, which is that gas pipeline that would bring gas and energy from Central Asia to South Asia, in particular to India and Pakistan. There's the CASA 1000 energy project that would bring electricity from Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan to South Asia to help drive the region's economic growth. But these projects, in order to be successful, require two things. First, they require peace and stability in Afghanistan in order to move forward. And second, they require cooperation among states in Central Asia and Afghanistan in order to build the infrastructure and agree on water usage rights and other issues related to natural resource use. So one of the big changes over the past several years in Central Asia that have affected these dynamics towards regional cooperation are changes that have taken place inside of Uzbekistan. And these economic and mostly economic reforms, and to some extent political reforms, have really created enormous opportunities in the region. And this is largely a function of the size and geographical features of the Uzbek state. Uzbekistan is the most populous country in the region. Its population is pretty close to that of Afghanistan. It's also the only country in the region that touches on all 5 Central Asian republics. So, and as I said, I include Afghanistan among them. So for decades, Uzbekistan promoted a very autarkic internal domestic policy that limited its ability to work with its neighbors. And its isolation in many spheres limited its potential to growth, as well as its ability to promote cooperation. What we saw in 2016 when President Shavkat Mirziyoyev came to power is that Uzbekistan changed its internal policy from one of real autarky that we saw under President Karimov to a national development strategy that's centered on economic growth and job creation. There's an understanding that in order to confront the country's growing population, to abate things like labor migration to Russia, that the country has to produce jobs for its growing population. And so this external pivot towards greater openness and greater economic relations towards its neighbors is really central to this country's new narrative. And so maintaining good relations with its neighbors and promoting trade and promoting cooperation has really unlocked a lot of hidden potential in the region. Potential that other countries, its neighbors, have not been able to achieve because they all had to go through Uzbekistan, or increased without a more open Uzbekistan. They had an increased cost of transportation and so many other issues. Uzbekistan's economy is also among the largest in the region, and so when these southern parts of Central Asia couldn't travel, couldn't cooperate with one another, it created enormous obstacles. So unlocking this has been really key. And we've seen this, especially in areas such as the Fergana Valley, where there has been increased regional cooperation, increased trade, and the ability of communities to work with one another. But there are also risks, and I'll talk about those in a second. Another important facet of this is that Uzbekistan is playing an important role in the peace process in Afghanistan. It's held talks and even hosted the Taliban in Uzbekistan. And this means that regardless of who is in power in Kabul, the government of Uzbekistan is actually poised to have good relations with those who may be in power. And in this way, even if the Taliban do take control of Kabul, as many fear, there is a possibility that some of these regional economic cooperation projects can continue. But of course, this remains very risky because even if the Taliban do take control of Kabul, there's no guarantee that there will be peace in the country. So finding a political solution to this conflict is very key to promoting greater partnership, greater development, and peace in the region. But over the past several weeks, we have seen conflicts between, actually the first intrastate conflict that we have seen in post-Soviet Central Asia between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan in the Fergana Valley. And this illustrates how fragile relations can become. And even if leaders at the national level do remain united on issues of cooperation and regional integration, it may not be the case that citizens share these views and share these values. And so it's imperative, and I think as this conflict, which really started as a grassroots conflict between communities in the Fergana Valley that quickly escalated to military conflict, it illustrates how vital it is to have people involved in these processes. And so while many of these changes that we've seen take place in Central Asia are quite top-down, without greater involvement of citizens in these processes, many of the hopes, many of the opportunities, and many of the potential that these reforms seek to unlock may not yield fruition. And of course, there are other regional actors that, of course, we have to take into account, and I haven't talked a lot about them. And I know Professor Blank will likely speak about this as well. And this is Russia and China. Russia has sought to expand its influence in Central Asia, and it sought it through the Eurasian Economic Union primarily, which includes Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. There's enormous pressure on Uzbekistan and Tajikistan to join this union. Uzbekistan joined as an observer last year. But it's also important to remember that as the United States rolls back its military presence in Afghanistan, that Russia has more than 7,000 troops stationed in Tajikistan and more troops in Kyrgyzstan and neighboring Kyrgyzstan. So many have talked about a security vacuum in the region. This may be as a consequence of the US withdrawal, but it's important to remember that each of these countries do have robust military forces. Russia is there, and of course, China is playing an increasingly important role, both economically and militarily in the region. So China has, through many initiatives, including the Belt and Road Initiative, is an important political player. But many countries in the region, especially Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, have increasing levels of debt to China, which lead to a risk of their own independence, their independence in foreign policy making, their independence in the ability to make sound fiscal decisions about what's going on in their countries. And there has been even discussion that Tajikistan has ceded some of its territory to China as a consequence of the fact that it couldn't pay for some of its debt several years ago. COVID-19 and the global pandemic that we have seen has created enormous uncertainty in the region, stymied some of the economic growth that we have seen, but many countries in the region seem to be quick to rebound from that crisis. We'll see what happens, but COVID-19 did illustrate that a huge variation in the ability of states to respond to this crisis. Now, we're also speaking about COVID-19, and many countries in Central Asia speak about COVID-19 as if it is a crisis that's past. And many of them have opened up and let down their guard with regard to this issue, even closing many COVID hospitals. Uzbekistan actually closed many of its COVID response clinics throughout the country. But as we're seeing in South Asia, in India and Nepal, that the COVID-19 crisis remains quite acute. Vaccination progress has not rolled out very quickly, and the region remains really quite at risk for another wave. So we'll keep our thoughts and prayers with many of our friends in Central Asia and South Asia, and thinking of our friends in India who are confronting this challenge right now. But it's something that we shouldn't forget as we think about these strategic, economic, and political reforms that we'll discuss today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jennifer Murtaza, for your speech. It was really informative, and you have covered a wide area on the topic. Now we move to our next expert, Dr. Stephen J. Blank, Senior Fellow at Foreign Policy Research Institute's Eurasia Program, former professor, United States Army War College. Over to you, Professor Blank. Please unmute yourself.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Tillotoma Foundation for inviting me to speak on this vital topic. The topic that I've been assigned to talk about is Central Asia and the Great Powers. And just putting together Central Asia and the Great Powers indicates that Central Asia is no longer merely an object of great power rivalry. Central Asian governments, individually and collectively, are now active subjects in Central Asia and shape regional developments, as Jennifer has been saying. The focus for this transformation are many, actually. There are many foci here. A major one right now is the United States' impending departure from Afghanistan, because this represents the last time a Western power has tried to work to shape Afghanistan, and once again, it has failed. We have to admit that there is no theory of victory, to use a military professional term, that is available to the United States. If it were to stay in Afghanistan, it would not achieve anything more than is already the case. But this is also very much a failure of the Afghan people as well. Despite more than 40 years of war, going back to 1978, when the uprising against communist rule started, Afghanistan has not been able to establish a stable state that commands the legitimacy and support of its own citizens, and the ensuing power vacuum has led every interested foreign power to try to become a player in Afghanistan. However, now those players are going to be mainly Asian ones. For the moment, there is no idea in American foreign policy, or at least nobody has brought one out, as to what American role in Central Asia is going to be after Afghanistan. And since Central Asian policy was largely derivative of what we were doing in Afghanistan, for the moment, there is no clear sign as to the importance the United States will attach to Central Asia, or if it's going to continue to keep military forces in or around the area. There's some talk of that, but we know very well that any U.S. military bases or deployments to Central Asia will instantly arouse the highest suspicion of China and Russia, among others, even beyond the very high levels of suspicion that already exist in those states. And they are trying to influence Afghanistan, as are India, Pakistan, and the neighboring Central Asian governments. Furthermore, and this is again a tragic but I think realistic conclusion, there is not the slightest sign that the Taliban will be able to govern Afghanistan peacefully or to establish any legitimacy. The thousands, if not millions, of people whose lives have been transformed over the last generation and who are modernizing, and the young women and girls who are going to school and so forth, will be victims of the Taliban, as we just saw tragically last week when they bombed the girls' school. That means that the Taliban has shown no capacity for government up till now, is likely to just generate another round of civil war in Afghanistan, rather than to create a viable government that commands the support of the people. And again, civil war will create a power vacuum which will suck in all the interested parties, in this case, the Asian governments. So unfortunately, I do not see that this impending American departure leads to peace or stability. Quite the opposite. It leads to great power Asian intervention and to greater probabilities of civil war and conflict. Very likely, Pakistan, China, and Russia will support each other against India's interests in Central Asia, because Russia and China, I think, are allies and certainly have been in Central Asia, even though China is gradually supplanting Russia there. Nevertheless, Russia's military presence there is very strong, relatively speaking, and the Russian government is not going to allow itself to be threatened by a vacuum in Afghanistan. They may think that the Taliban will not export terrorism to Central Asia, but I'm not sure that the Taliban has the authority to control Afghanistan, or that it would really not end up being a purveyor of terror to Afghanistan, if not beyond, as we've already seen many times. At the same time, Central Asia itself is undergoing a major transformation. Jennifer mentioned some of this. Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan are transforming themselves well beyond where they were and become sponsors of regional cooperation. Turkmenistan remains a black box. It is difficult, if not impossible, to understand what's going on there. However, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are two countries that are not getting anywhere fast. They are not making really the necessary economic and political progress. Their governments are autocratic. In Kyrgyzstan, it might even be heavily infested with criminals. And Tajikistan, to call things by their real name, is essentially a drug-running state owned by the Rahman family, who is participating in the narcotics trafficking and controls the entire state. But as a result, there is very little positive economic or political development there. And the gulf between those two states in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan is going to grow. Furthermore, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are already at dagger's point, as we've seen. They are fighting over borders. Tajikistan and other Central Asian states feel threatened by Afghanistan because there is the real prospect of Central Asian terrorism coming out of a Taliban-led Afghanistan. And therefore, we are going to see many months, if not years, of maneuvering among all of these actors to try and bring about an Afghanistan that suits them, because the Afghan people in government have been unable to bring about an Afghanistan that is a viable state and not a threat to anybody by virtue of its own stability. Furthermore, the EU's role in Central Asia, although it might be a positive one, is very limited. The United States' role is completely unclear at this time. And we see a Russo-Chinese alliance that is undermining, or rather, I should say, reshaping relationships in Central Asia. Russia has drawn much closer to Pakistan, and has even had military assistance with it, although it's nothing compared to what Russia and India have had. Nevertheless, it is very clear that we can see the erosion of what was the Russian-Indian relationship over time. How far that erosion is going to go remains uncertain. But it's very clear that the government in Moscow is going to choose China over India in any major crisis. And it's going to also choose playing its own role in Afghanistan at the expense of other states when it's challenged. Furthermore, there's no sign that Putin is going to move away from China. China is gradually increasing not only its economic presence across Central Asia, but its military presence. It has at least 2 bases in Central Asia already, and it may be trying to get more. Furthermore, because of what China is doing at home, the genocide, and that's the only word that applies here, that it's carrying out against the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, it is going to be very vigilant about any Muslim terrorism coming out of Afghanistan, and will probably have to increase its equities in Central Asia. So my take on the future of Central Asia and the great powers is that it will largely be an Asian game, if you want to use that metaphor, but it will not be a game that is peaceful or primarily economic. Unfortunately, Afghanistan is not going to come out of the American experience with a government that is stable or legitimate, and this will simply tempt all the interested actors into another round of conflict that will probably last several years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Stephen Blank, for your excellent analysis. And thanks to both Professor Blank and Dr. Jennifer for bringing in the question of Afghanistan also into the ambit of analysis. If Professor Ziegler, are you there? Professor Ziegler? Yeah. So my next speaker is Professor Charles E. Ziegler, Professor and University Scholar, Department of Political Science, University of Louisville, Director, Gravimer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. So over to you, Professor Ziegler.
Okay, well, thank you very much. My apologies for coming in late. I only just received the other link to this. I want to talk a bit today about U.S. strategy in Central Asia and the Indo-Pacific, tied into that. Dr. Blank just mentioned about the U.S. position being unclear at this time. I'll see if I can shed a little clarity on it, although I agree with him that it's kind of hard to figure out where exactly the U.S. is going. So American foreign policy towards Central Asia has, as we've heard, been largely derivative of its relations with Russia and China, linked to the U.S. Operations in Afghanistan, and also connected to American interests in energy and democracy promotion. The emphasis placed on each of these interests has varied over the past 3 decades, and U.S. policy has often reflected contradictory impulses. However, the location of Central Asia at the nexus of great power competition, energy, the threat of terrorism, has in the past elevated this region to a relatively outsized position in U.S. foreign policy. And in turn, geopolitical strategic considerations, together with it, I think we would say skillful diplomacy on the part of most Central Asian leaders, have enabled these small countries to punch well above their weight in global politics. I see at least three distinct phases in U.S. policy towards Central Asia. In the first decade, from 1991, the collapse, to about 2001, Washington sought to establish sovereignty and independence for these new states, to secure nuclear weapons and materials located in the former Soviet republics, Kazakhstan and Central Asia, to assist in the transition toward more democratic and market-oriented systems, and also to promote opportunities for American businesses. Second phase, from 2001 to 2014, security concerns dominated as Central Asia became a key staging point for America's campaign in Afghanistan following the 9/11 attacks. In the third phase, from 2014 to the present, I see fatigue with the conflicts in Afghanistan and the Middle East, and reduced interest in democracy promotion that have led to a gradual disengagement from the region, protestations notwithstanding. Although Central Asia is still needed to assist U.S. efforts in extricating its troops from Afghanistan and maintaining regional stability. And the one, I think, bright spot especially are the potential for reforms in Uzbekistan. I'd stress continuity in U.S. approaches. The Trump administration, for all its wild swings in foreign policy, continued much of what the Obama administration did, and looks like the Biden administration is building on this. In 2020, the Trump administration released an official U.S. strategy for Central Asia that spelled out Washington's goals in the region. The strategy continues the policies of previous administrations. The core objectives of the strategy were to support sovereignty and independence of the Central Asian states, reduce terrorist threats in the region, expand support for stability in Afghanistan, and to encourage closer ties with that country, promote human rights, rule of law, and support U.S. investment. Unstated, but the subtext is that the strategy seeks to limit Russian and Chinese influence in the region, contain China's Belt and Road Initiative, encourage the reform process in Uzbekistan, and expand participation in global politics, and enlist the Central Asian states in fighting terrorism. Key objective, I would stress, is to stabilize and integrate Afghanistan into the broader region along the lines that Fred Starr has argued for years as the U.S. undertakes its withdrawal on September 11th. The C5+1 format that the Obama administration initiated in 2015 was retained by the Trump administration, which I thought was interesting. And in April of this year, Secretary of State Blinken met with his Central Asian counterparts through this dialogue framework. The idea is that by deepening political, economic, and military engagement with the C5+1 mechanism, Washington hopes then to provide Central Asia's rulers with a counterweight to Russian and Chinese influence. Washington's efforts to counter the Belt and Road Initiative may keep the U.S. engaged, although American programs such as the International Development Finance Corporation, the CASA 1000, Electricity Transmission Project, the Blue Dot Network Infrastructure Project. I mean, these are modest proposals at best. That said, however, more transparent investment processes that use market-oriented principles or public-private partnerships and which bring together interested democracies such as India, Japan, and Australia may partially erode China's predatory policies. And I think their debt trap strategies are becoming increasingly apparent to the vulnerable, especially the smaller countries in Central Asia. Beyond Afghanistan, the U.S. faces a choice, I think, of either competing with China, Russia, and Iran in Central Asia, or retreating from the region and conceding influence. While we've not seen any major changes in policy during the first months of the Biden administration, The new president's willingness to confront Beijing and Moscow over human rights issues and democracy could increase regional tensions. Moscow, despite the challenge from China, seems determined to preserve and expand its regional presence through the Eurasian Economic Union, the STO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and will likely continue to resist American presence, barring any radical improvement in U.S.-Russian relations, which I don't see on the horizon. Beijing, at the present time, shares leadership of the SCO with Moscow. But the Sino-Russian relationship in Central Asia is in many respects competitive. Russia still has a military advantage in the region, but I think it's losing that to China and certainly can't match the financial resources that China's committing through the Belt and Road Initiative, nor can the U.S. for that matter. So in this environment, the U.S. may choose to become more of an offshore balancer, relying especially on the big two, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and also, I think, on India, to assume more responsibility for regional stability. Prospects, I think, for preserving or extending American influence in Central Asia are not especially good. Within the U.S., deep partisan divisions carry over into international relations, and that makes consistent policy towards Central Asia, or any other region for that matter, increasingly difficult. Promoting human rights and democracy are part of the Biden administration's agenda, unlike that of Trump's. But this approach is not likely, I think, to yield major policy changes. There are, granted, some economic opportunities for American business, most notably in the field of energy and with the reforms in Uzbekistan. But the major oil and gas fields are already under production, and demand for hydrocarbons is likely to decline in the coming years in any case. And unlike certain other nationalities, the Central Asians have a minuscule demographic presence in the U.S. and no influential lobbies. To summarize this, to wrap it up, recent U.S. policy, I think, has been marked by a growing fatigue with the endless wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, Middle East, and then the search for an exit strategy from Afghanistan. And this started under Obama, it continued under Trump, and we see it now with Biden. In Central Asia, the U.S. faces pretty stiff competition for influence from both Russia and China, and it has a dubious ally at best in Pakistan. On the positive side, however, the U.S. has an increasingly valuable security partner in India. Washington's policy toward the region has exhibited a fair amount of continuity, I would argue, across both Democratic and Republican administrations. And I expect that U.S. policy under President Joe Biden will certainly display greater professionalism and nuance than it did under the Trump administration, reflecting a return to traditional statecraft. But I would say the basic contours of Washington's approach to the region are likely to remain unchanged. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ziegler. You laid out the nuances of the American foreign policy towards Central Asia and the various opportunities and challenges that are to arise in the near future. I now move to my next speaker, Mr. Azimat Takirov, Senior Research Fellow from Uzbekistan.
Hello. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to greet all participants and express my gratitude to the organizers of this event. In my today's speech, I would like to concentrate at the Uzbekistan foreign policy toward Central Asia. As His Excellency Ambassador Dilshod Akhatov mentioned in previous session, recent years Central Asia has undergone a radical transformation. The positive trends observed in the region have affected almost all spheres, as political, economic, cultural, and humanitarian. As the evidence of this, we could see increased frequency of contacts between heads of states, increase in trade volumes, and the implementation of large joint projects. If we talk about foreign policy of Uzbekistan, the president of Uzbekistan, Uzbekistan, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, from the first day of his election, identified Central Asia as a priority of the country's strategy. So since then, we held a lot of events focused on Central Asian issues. For example, since 2017, by the initiative of President, an annual specialized economic forum of the business community has been held. This forum is one of the largest economic platforms in the region for dialogue between business, scientific community, the government of the Central Asian countries. In 2018, in Tashkent, a high-level international conference on the development of the transport and transit potential of the Central Asian region was held. Moreover, one of the biggest events in the region, the first consultative meeting of the heads of states of Central Asia was held in Tashkent in 2019. And this year, we expect to hold the third consultative meeting. In addition, this year is planned to organize a high-level conference, Central and South Asia, Regional Connectivity, Challenges and Opportunities, which was announced by the President of Uzbekistan on December 2020, I guess. If we look at the geopolitical situation in the region, for the last years, progress on many long-standing issues could be seen. For example, the negotiation process aimed to resolve the issues of demarcation and delimitation of the state borders is being actively pursued. The negotiation process for mutually acceptable solution on the issue of water usage has begun. In 2020, despite the pandemic situation, the countries managed to maintain interaction and in some cases provided assistance to each other. A striking confirmation of the fact that Central Asia is a priority of Uzbekistan for region policy is the initiative to establish our institute, International Institute for Central Asia. Our institute focused on several areas. Firstly, analysis of domestic political and socio-economic trends in the Central Asian countries and the development of the practical proposal and recommendation on that basis. The second, an analysis of the political, legal, economic, humanitarian, and other aspects of interaction between Central Asian countries, as well as the state and prospect of jointly solving the problem facing the states of the region. Of course, it's always pleasing to talk about positive progress and solving problematic issues. But at the same time, it has the presence of a large number of issues requiring urgent solution or careful discussion with our neighbors in order to minimize challenges and threats for Central Asian countries. One of them, as mentioned before, is the Afghanistan factor. Afghanistan affects international and regional security, and this factor requires special consideration in our research. So, finishing my speech, I would like to underline that the trends and achievements of the past few years indicate that Central Asia is transforming. So, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your speech, Mr. Takirov. There have been some questions, so I would like to take the response from Professor Blank on the question that what role does he think India can play in the Central Asian Partnership in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. Please unmute yourself.
Yes. Look, India is now undergoing a very tragic moment because of its failure to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. And until it gets that issue under control, all of its foreign policy issues are going to come second. And what's more, if you don't get that issue under control sooner rather than later, apart from the terrible human cost that it will lead to, it will undermine India's reputation abroad. Particularly, India was trying to make a name for itself with regard to pharmaceuticals. That would be a terrible irony. But it also speaks to a larger problem, I think, in Central Asia. India has not, and I've said this in the chat, India has not been able to forge a Central Asian strategy that allows it to play a role in Central Asia commensurate with its real capabilities. There are many reasons for this. Pakistani opposition, I think incoherence in Indian policymaking, perhaps, the opposition of Russia and China as well. But because the situation in Afghanistan is about to take such a major turn, and India has so much invested there, and furthermore, because Pakistan is determined to create violence in Afghanistan until it gets its way there, that there's no alternative for India but to be involved in Afghanistan and all of Central Asia to satisfy its own vital, and I emphasize the word vital, interests there. So it's absolutely essential that you overcome the COVID-19 crisis as soon as possible for obviously many, many reasons. But also in the shorter term and immediate term, India needs to come up with a Central Asian policy that it can really carry out and that will enhance India's position in that region.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. To Dr. Jennifer, since you also deal with markets and governance, I want to ask you about how the economic scenario in Central Asian republics has evolved, from a planned economy to the market economy stage. How do you see this evolution has happened now that 3 decades have passed since their independence? And what role do international players play in this scenario, especially players like China, Russia, and the United States? Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, so I think that's a very good question. Those relationships are still evolving. And I don't think the transition away from those planned economies is quite complete. And this is especially true. Kazakhstan has made sort of the most strides in this area, Kyrgyzstan as well, but Kyrgyzstan's economy remains quite small. And you can see one of the consequences of this lack of economic transformation is the major labor migration that has taken place from Central Asia to Kazakhstan, to Russia primarily. And this is something we actually didn't speak about in terms of Russia's geopolitical interests in Central Asia. Labor migration is really an important factor in maintaining those relations. And it's those relations, Russia's economic stake in Central Asia are also defined by the human capital, which is leaving Central Asia and in Russia. So Russia maintains enormous influence over Central Asia via labor migration. But it's quite interesting to see over the past several months, we've seen major labor shortages in Russia, and quite possibly seeing some of the tables turned on this a bit, where Russia is trying to do everything it can to shore up these labor shortages. And it may give Central Asian republics a bit of leverage, but I think this is highly unlikely. In terms of other important economic transformations, we've yet to see what's going to happen inside of Uzbekistan. The country has promised major reforms. We've seen, my more optimistic note at the beginning was really focused on Uzbekistan's external reforms, which increased access. If you're looking from the Central Asian perspective and a Central Asia looking towards Afghanistan, things look quite different than they did 5 years ago when these borders remained closed, when Afghanistan, for example, didn't exist, really from the eyes, except as a very severe threat. Now there's much more engagement and a better understanding, for example, the government of Uzbekistan and how it can deal with the evolving threats that I think Dr. Blank outlined so eloquently in his talk. So countries have to really hedge their bets and understand that, and so I think Uzbekistan is making an important strides in this. But in terms of its domestic economic reforms, I'm very concerned about some of the things I'm seeing coming out of Uzbekistan right now. The sort of classic early winners dynamics that we saw across many of the former Soviet republics. You begin transitions, and those transitions easily become captured by a narrow group, and the economic reforms don't move as fast or forward as they could. And, Tajikistan is another area where we haven't seen major economic reforms. And I think Dr. Blank illustrated some of the major challenges we see there. So where the opportunities really are in terms of foreign economic relations, trade, and with some hope that those external relations do shore up some opportunities for more domestic economic reforms.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jennifer. I think you really summarized the economic scenario. And talking about Russia, I would like to come to Professor Ziegler. I would take your comment on the previous question as well, but also how do you see, Russian sort of great power aspirations and ambition in the Central Asian region, 3 decades from their independence, and also, now that with the role of President Putin, his ambitions. So how do you see the scenario? I mean, does Russia still of course, Russia considers Central Asia within its ambit of influence. So in this relation, now that the United States Army is sort of moving out of Afghanistan, how do you see this play out?
Well, I'd say that Russia definitely sees Central Asia within its sphere of privileged interest, as Medvedev put it some 10 years ago or more. It's at the present time, I think, not quite as significant for Russia as Ukraine and Belarus, but it's still very important. It's interesting in the relationship with China that Russia's been willing to cede a fair amount of influence to China, and certainly, I know a lot of Russia specialists are nervous about this, but Mr. Putin tends to override them. And I certainly agree, with Steve Blank's point about the China relationship being critical, in particular for Mr. Putin. And so they've reached a modus vivendi in Central Asia. But over the long term, I think, as in so many other respects, Russia is slipping behind China, and they're going to have to confront that issue at some point, because it's going to be hard to be a great power, even a great regional power, when much of the region is being dominated by China. So I think that's an issue. On the question that you posed to my good friend Steve Blank a little bit ago about India and COVID, I just expanded a little and say something to keep in mind with both India and the United States that I think goes beyond the current administrations is this growing populism. And we usually talk about populism in terms of its impact on democratic governance, which is negative. But I think what it means for foreign policy in both of our countries is that this large chunk of the population that buys into the populist argument is not keen on seeing adventures abroad, if you will. And certainly Central Asia is a hard sell in the United States. I'm less familiar with India. You may have some thoughts on that. But to make the argument that it's really in U.S. national interest to promote democracy in Central Asia, to provide vaccines, to contest with China and Russia for influence, the policy wonks in Washington are going to buy into it, but a good chunk of the American population won't. And I would suspect that a good part of the Indian population who are populist and who've rallied around Modi probably feel about the same way. And I don't see populism as really declining over the near term. And so I think we have to take that into account when we talk about a foreign policy. Russia and China, as authoritarian states, don't really need to worry about that. So far, they've been able to control it.
Thank you so much, Professor Ziegler, for your comments. I now come to Dr. Meena Singh Roy, head of Western Central Asia Center, Tillotoma Foundation, to make her comments and ask her questions. Then we will, of course, come to the other questions that we have received, and I request all the 3 panelists to comment on that. Dr. Singh Roy.
Thank you, Soham. I have a question to Professor Stephen Blank and a comment on India's role in Central Asia. I remember Professor Blank, you citing my article long time back, which I wrote on India's interest in Central Asia. And let me come back to how it is. I mean, those days it's a pretty 2005 or 6 article which you sort of referred to in your article on which was published long time back. But two things which I want to bring to the notice of the audience. Yes, when we are talking about India's role in Central Asia and, for example, in Afghanistan, Pakistan has its nuisance value, number one. That is what I say as far as Pakistan is concerned. Number two, Pakistan cannot stop India from building its, partnership, which it has built over the years. Now, when we talk about India's role in Central Asia, I am not referring to the role which China or US or Russia plays, but India has its a very unique position as far as Central Asia is concerned. And I often compare that with the willing partners who are an acceptable partners, in Central Asia, who are welcome partners, are Japan and Korea. This is how I look at it. Now, if we look at past few years, India has redefined this engagement with the Eurasian region, number one. It has focused on building its special partnership with Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. Whether we talk about, the economic partnership, yes, it is the weak link. Whether we are talking about connectivity, whether we are talking about building the defense cooperation, and India has been trying to offer what Central Asia requires, which is capacity building. That is the major difference. Now, India, I don't think can compete with China for two reasons. Number one, China has its ways to deal with the situation, which India cannot, follow the same rules when it comes to Central Asia. So if you see the past 4 to 5 years of India's engagement with Central Asia, we talk about the Connect Central Asia vision. Yes, that was a vision document which came much before the Chinese premier talked about the Silk Route economic belt. But, the attention which China draws, I mean, when you talk to the Central Asians, they say that we are sandwiched between two major powers. China and Russia are compulsion, but India, Japan, Korea, they are the ones who we want them to play a very, very significant role as they expect. So the expectations may be high, but what India has delivered in terms of what the Central Asians want, maybe there is much more that India can do. But I think the momentum which has started, you see the visits of the Uzbek leadership to India. If you see their participation in the Gujarat activities, the business activities. If you see how track 1.5 has been gone has taken different level with the foreign ministers meeting. So I think there is a progress when we are talking about India's role in Central Asia. There is maybe with Turkmenistan, it is not the same as we would have expected. When we talk about the connectivity, there is INSTC, there is Chabahar, which is still moving forward. India has also talked about bringing in Uzbekistan, Afghanistan. So trilateral, quadrilateral cooperation is being implemented, and I think it will probably continue. Afghanistan is one, I think, quagmire where you very rightly said nobody has won the game, So how things will unfold in Afghanistan, we don't know. Pakistan would continue to be a spoiler, I can tell you this much. Pakistan will try and limit India's, outreach in Afghanistan, but But how, the unpredictability is the factor when we're talking Afghanistan. I don't think anybody can predict what is going to happen. You talked about, Professor Blank, about the Asian game in Central Asia. Would you like to elaborate a little more on this? And point number two, I want to know, as far as United States role in Central Asia is concerned, has US decided that it's going to leave it to China? Is that what will happen ultimately, or would they want to cooperate with Russia? Because Russia, from my point of view, cooperation with Russia is any day better than letting China, have its hegemonic designs in that part of the world. I mean, I would like your comment on that, and I think I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Singh Roy. I will come to take the comments from Professor Blank, Dr. Jennifer, and Professor Ziegler. But in the meantime, we have Professor Andrei Kazanschev, Director of the IIS Center for Central Asia and Afghanistan, MGIMO University from Russia. Professor Kazanschev, the floor is yours. Professor Kazanschev, can you hear me? The floor is yours. We can't hear you. Please unmute.
Yeah. Do you hear me? Do you hear me? Hello.
Yes, we see.
Sorry, I came late because there were some issues with the link, and also my webcam is broken. So sorry for how I look, because I'm a little bit crippled now. I would like to discuss the situation in Central Asia in terms of Russian views and Russian interests. Although I would start from disclaimer that I do not represent any official position. Actually, this affiliation is already wrong, which is here, because now I am professor in the High School of Economics. I have left my position in GIMO. I would say that also continuation of my disclaimer that the things that I would tell you reflect only my own position, not any official position, and not even the position of the majority of Russian experts, because I am considered as a little bit too liberal on some issues. So I think the majority of Russian experts have more anti-Westernist, etc. views than me. First of all, I would say that we see a combination of some trends in the region of Central Asia. Some of them are positive, some of them are negative. And also I can say that now, especially when we have this situation in Afghanistan, which we have today, we cannot discuss, especially from the point of view of Russian from the point of view of Russian interest, we cannot avoid discussing combination of Central Asian and Afghan issues. You know that in the northern part of Afghanistan, there is traditional harbor of different terrorist groups connected with some organization like Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, for example, and with some terrorist groups from Northern Caucasus, etc. And this was originally the cause why President Putin was quite positive about American military presence in Afghanistan. And actually, even a year before, when we have all this new Cold War between Russia and America, Putin said on Russian TV that he positively viewed American military presence in Afghanistan. And just because of this, because Russia itself was highly interested in elimination of all these groups. Unfortunately, this hasn't happened throughout all the period of American military presence. So all these groups of Central Asian and Northern Caucasian origin are still in Afghanistan. And we have three tendencies. First of all, they have moved from Pakistan, northwest Pakistan, where they were hiding, to northern Afghanistan. So they have returned there once again. Second, these groups have close connections with these connections are traditional, I mean, with Taliban and Al Qaeda. And also, they have new connections within such groups as ISIS Khorasan. And many Russian experts see some growing interaction between ISIS Khorasan and all these ethnic groups positioned in northern Afghanistan. And this is, from Russian point of view, the major threat to such countries as Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan. Of course, Russia is not responsible for Turkmenistan because Turkmenistan is officially neutral, but Russia still guarantees the security of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. And if we go back to history, to the 1990s, for example, at the end of 1990s, there was a Balkan War when the group of militants of Islamic movement of Uzbekistan crossed Tajik border, and they moved quickly through Tajikistan unopposed. Then they came to Kyrgyzstan, and it turned out that it was absolutely impossible to do anything with them, taking into account how Kyrgyz authorities and Kyrgyz security services are organized. And we are really afraid that the same things can happen once again. If we look at the situation in Afghanistan today, we see that there is a combination of factors. First of all, American withdrawal is sometimes very quick, and Afghan authorities do not even sometimes know that Americans are withdrawing, as it happened recently in Kandahar. So Afghans at morning discovered that Americans simply retreated without warning them. At least this is what Afghans said. And we see the growth of different terrorist acts in Afghanistan and general deterioration of security situation in the country. I can remind you of a recent attack on girls' school in Kabul and other acts of violence. According to official data for actually it's United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, and this is for April. There was 1.6 increase in the number of civilian deaths. It was from March. The data was from April, and it covered the period between January and March. So there was 1.6% increase in the number of civilian deaths and 47% increase in the number of civilian injuries. But this doesn't include statistics from April and May, where the situation once again deteriorated. And of course, this is a major threat to all Central Asian nations because the borders are quite porous. And you know that there is a very dangerous combination of two factors. Number one, there is presence of Central Asian extremists in the northern regions of Afghanistan. Number two, these groups have connections in their own countries. For example, all the region of Fergana Valley is penetrated by different groups that have connections with either ISIS or Al Qaeda, etc. Especially the situation in Kyrgyzstan, in Fergana Valley, part of Kyrgyzstan is dangerous from this point of view. And also, there is a combination of all this with drug trafficking along the northern route. So the situation in parts of all the parts of Kyrgyz and Tajik borders actually are not controlled by the authorities. Because there is a major trade route by Afghan drugs coming from northern Afghanistan through Tajikistan, Fergana Valley of Kyrgyzstan, Osh being the major destination where these drugs are resold, etc. Then it goes to Kazakhstan, then to Russia, and then to Eastern and Northern Europe. And it is not by coincidence, I mean, that that the situation on Kyrgyz-Tajik border itself is deteriorating because actually there is a combination of negative events in Afghanistan and negative events in Central Asia itself. So recently we saw fighting on Kyrgyz-Tajik border, a mini war between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Just on the same border where we have this Balkan war, where we have all this drug trafficking, etc. And of course, this is quite worrying from the point of view of Russia's security, and not only Russia's security, but also from the point of view of European security. Because I mean that in case of major deterioration of situation on in northern Afghanistan and Central Asia, there will be waves of refugees which will come through Russia to Europe. Because Russia is in very deep economic crisis and it cannot simply host all these refugees. Also, unfortunately, there is a major potential of involvement of regional powers in Afghan issues. This is positive from one point of view. I mean that Russia, India, China, Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, they all have their stakes in Afghanistan. Yes, but there is also potential for a new war. Because if we go back to the 1990s, what we saw, Pakistan had its proxies, Turkey had its proxies, Russia had Tajiks as Russia's proxies, etc. We can return once again to this situation. Actually, I mean that already national minorities in the northern Afghanistan, they say that, okay, there is a very high potential of collision, of plot, of push to people in the government with the push to people in Taliban, and all this will be at the expense of national minorities, mostly Tajiks. If we go to Afghan army, I mean, there is very, very bad feeling in the army because army is mostly made, I mean, the core of army is made up of Tajik officers who were Northern Alliance. And they see all these developments very skeptically. And in case of coming of Taliban to power in Kabul, there will be a new civil war as it was in the 1990s. So this part of army will simply go to the northern Afghanistan, and then we'll have the same war, where Russia will have to support probably Tajiks, Turkey will support Uzbeks, Pakistan will support Pushtu, etc. And this will be a tragedy, a new period of civil war in Afghanistan. I mean, it can have negative effect. First of all, I mean, from the point of view of harboring different terrorist groups in Afghanistan, because if there is this chaos in Afghanistan, so many different terrorists, drug traffickers, etc., so they will have their own opportunities to exploit from the territory of Afghanistan. As for Central Asia, I cannot say that there are only negative trends. Of course, there are negative trends and there are positive trends. These positive trends, from the point of view, I mean, of security of Russia, Europe, etc., they can partially compensate for deteriorating situation in Afghanistan. For example, there are quite positive events in Uzbekistan. Before Karimov's death, I mean, everyone saw with fear what can happen, what could happen in Uzbekistan, but everything is going on very, very well, actually. We cannot say that Uzbekistan is turning into Western-style democracy, etc., but still, I mean, the things there are pretty good. I quite often visit Uzbekistan, and in terms of foreign investments, growing currency reserves, growth of income of ordinary citizens, etc., it's quite a good country now. By Central Asian standards, of course. Although, of course, inflation is also growing, etc. What is very important, there is a new style of Uzbek foreign policy under Mirziyoyev. So there is a change of environment in relation with all the neighbors, especially with Tajikistan. Under President Karimov, there was a transportation blockade and even the threat of war as a retaliation for construction of Ragun Dam, etc.
Professor Kazanschev.
Yeah?
Yeah, if you can conclude in 30 seconds.
Okay, thank you. So I can say that there is a combination of all these positive and negative factors, and as one more factor that I would add is important factor of crisis of multi-vector foreign policies of Central Asian nations, because their policy was always to establish good relations with all the major great powers. And now when we have all these geopolitical conflicts in the world, their multi-vector foreign policies are in deep crisis. Although the way in which they try to get out of this crisis, I personally quite like, because they renewed what we can call Central Asian integration. So they meet in group of 5, etc. So this is quite positive reaction, although we do not know what new negative impact all these geopolitical tendencies around the region can have. Thank you very much. I mean, there are many different factors, but I would concentrate just on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kazanschev, for your excellent analysis of the Russian engagement with Central Asia and also your own analysis. Thank you so much. I think we can now discuss a bit. There have been some questions on the Kyrgyz-Tajik conflict issue. There are some questions for Professor Kazanschev. I will come to you after that. But first, let me come to Dr. Jennifer and hear her opinion on this. And her.
Yes, no, I think Dr. Kazanschev, a very important presentation. And I just want to add one point that I think is very a new development that we're seeing in the region that deserves attention, especially in the Afghan-Tajik border. That, historically, there was a fear from Central Asian republics, from Russia, that you saw these groups like the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, Islamic State Khorasan, these groups that had been in Pakistan for some years. After security campaigns in Pakistan, they returned back to Afghanistan. That these were sort of the Central Asian militants. That is changing very, very quickly. We know that there were many Central Asians went to fight with ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Many of them have returned. But there is this, you have to ask yourselves, we have to ask ourselves, there were so many of these people who left. Now Syria is no longer an option. Increasingly, we're seeing numbers of Tajiks, especially Tajiks from Tajikistan, going in to northern Afghanistan. And this is a new generation of Central Asian fighters. I wouldn't call it a complete generation, but increasing numbers of Central Asians are leaving, especially Tajikistan, from areas of Heartland, from not just the Fergana Valley, and they're going into northern Afghanistan. And not long ago, several of them overran a district center in Badakhshan province in Afghanistan. So they are joining, and many of them are, fighting the Afghan government. President Rahman called on citizens who live on the border region to protect the Tajik border from militants coming over. And the militants that they're concerned about isn't the Taliban. It's their own citizens who have left recently. And this is a new group of fighters. And I think it's something that we all deserves our attention. Of course, we don't want to exaggerate this, but if we think about the numbers that left for Syria and Iraq, this is the deteriorating situation in northern Afghanistan. This isn't far away. This is right there. And the ability of Tajikistan to protect its own border is really a question. And this is where Russia really plays an enormous role. So I'll just leave things there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, sure. Dr. Kazanschev, go ahead.
I completely agree, actually, with your analysis. I mean that you are absolutely right. There is a new threat. A new generation of fighters, not only of Tajik origin, but also I would emphasize people from Chechnya, etc., who also come to Afghanistan. And this is a danger, and Russia is aware of that. You know that CSTO conducted special exercises, etc. But all this was based on the premise that Central Asian states would not fight with each other. Now they have used Russian armament to fight each other, and this is a real danger. And also we have crisis on Turkmen border, which is very important because Turkmenistan is officially neutral and no one would defend it in case of any crisis. I mean, they have no agreements, security agreements with USA, with Russia, with China, etc. Probably China would defend their gas supplies, etc., but still they do not have any official agreements on that. And they do not have army, as opposed to Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan. They have strong army created by Russia. Turkmenistan doesn't have any army at all, de facto.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kazanschev. I will come back to you, but let me now take a comment from Professor Blank. I think there were a number of questions posed to you. You can make it. Please unmute yourself.
Yes, I was asked whether or not India should continue to invest in Iran, particularly with regard to the Chabahar program, despite the U.S. sanctions on Iran. India has continued up till now to maintain its investment in this program. The irony is that it's not the U.S. sanctions on Iran that is going to be the major problem for India. It's the Chinese-Iran treaty that was just signed, the agreement that was signed between Beijing and Tehran, because Beijing used this opportunity to gain control, I believe, of the railroad and of some of the infrastructure at Chabahar in order to checkmate India and, for that matter, Russia, because the whole idea of a north-south transit, what was called Instinct, INSTC project, was to bring Russian commerce through Astrakhan and the Caspian Sea to Iran and then down to India. And now that China is trying to intervene in there, it is China that is encroaching on Indian and Russian interests rather than the United States. So the irony here is that although the American sanctions for the moment continue, and I suspect they're going to continue, because if for no other reason, public opinion in the United States is not going to be soft on Iran after what we are seeing now in the Middle East. The biggest problem that India is going to face is the Irano-China agreement.
Thank you so much, Professor Blank. I'll come to Professor Ziegler and get from him his understanding of the discussion so far, and if he wants to contribute himself.
All right. Well, Dr. Roy posed a very interesting question, and she asked if is the U.S. going to simply leave Central Asia to China, or maybe cooperate with Russia in the region? And of course, that gets at the trilateral relationship, which is a very interesting one. If you look at this in terms of interests, yes, the U.S. and Russia share security interests in the region, but I'm not sure I see them cooperating on it. Russia has repeatedly proposed this idea of the CSTO and NATO dividing up security in different regions, and NATO's never been very amenable to this. If you look at the economic dimension, there it's certainly, I think, competitive, certainly from the Russian perspective, that American corporations want to benefit from the energy resources and deny profits to Russia. In the more political arena, certainly Russia's opposed to America's democracy promotion projects, civil society support for competitive parties, and that sort of thing. So when you look at it in terms of interests, I would say that Russia's interests align much more closely with those of China in Central Asia than do, say, the U.S. and Russia. Another issue here is simply, well, the role of Congress, and I guess what I would say the sort of irrational aspect of U.S.-Russia relations. This is one thing that Democrats and Republicans agree on, right now in the U.S. is that they're very suspicious of Russia. And so there are real political considerations here to trying to cooperate with Russia. And finally, I just leave you with this thought. I've been working a fair amount on Russia in the Pacific recently, and that is one area where you really could see Russia and the United States cooperating against China to act as a balancer. Certainly, the U.S. is looking to India to do that. That's the whole Indo-Pacific concept. And yet we can't really achieve much in the way of cooperation with Russia in the Pacific. So I very much doubt we could do it in Central Asia.
Thank you so much, Professor Ziegler. So I think I would ask Dr. Singh Roy if you want to make a comment, and then I will take a 2-minute concluding comments from all the three speakers.
Did you want me to make
No, I come to Dr. Singh Roy, and then I said I will take comments from all three of you. Yeah.
Thank you, Soham. It has been really a very interesting discussion today. And there are many unanswered questions, and no debate, I think, provides you very conclusive answers to the very complicated questions and a very complicated situation which exists in this part of the world when we talk about Asia, the Southern Asia, West Asia, and of course, which includes Central Asia as well. Nonetheless, I think I'm an extremely optimistic person, and as a researcher, our job is to provide the negatives and the positives and then see how it works out for the policymakers. And from the Russian perspective, I think, India, is looking towards building a stronger partnership with all the regional partners, I would say, which includes China as well, despite the major problems that we have. And this is where the geography plays a role. You cannot choose your neighbors. And to deal with your difficult neighbors like China and Pakistan, I think, there would be realignments of the kind of the power play and the game that we would see unfolding in coming years. To what extent, the interest of the countries in different regions, would collide or would work together, we will need to see. Professor, you made a very interesting point that, US may want to cooperate with Russia in the Pacific. Now, maybe US, I don't know how Russians look at it, because the Russians have a completely different version of the Indo-Pacific. And maybe our friend, from Russia can add something to it. But ultimately, what all of us are looking at, the countries, like Afghanistan should not go back to the situation where it was, because it is going to impact mainly the social fabric, the education, the women, so they are the ones who are going to be suffering more than anybody else. And when we look at the questions of human rights, when we look at the questions of development, sustainable development, and the rare earth minerals that Afghanistan has, I think the game which will unfold would be somewhat different. Yes, we are talking about the greater role which the Asian players can play in the country, but what would be the shape and the scope of cooperation? Will it be the bilateral or trilateral or sub-regional cooperation that will work is to be seen, I guess, in future. So I'll stop here. And it was wonderful listening to all of you. Thank you so much for coming on this platform and expressing your views. We are planning to publish, something on India and Central Asia, bringing in other dimensions. And I hope we would be able to do it soon with, getting papers from all of you as and when it is convenient, because we all are in our own houses due to COVID-19. It has opened up many opportunities while we are still struggling to deal with it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sinroy. Yes, we invite all of you to send in your written publications for the publication. I come to Dr. Blank, and as you make your concluding remark, I also want to ask you about your opinion on the relevance of the Heartland theory, since we referred to it in our concept note as well. So, how do you see the Heartland theory play out, in this third decade of the 21st century, or the third decade of the 21st century? How do you see it play out?
Well, I lost part of your question. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I asked about the Heartland theory, Mackinder's Heartland theory, and Central Asia.
Well, I've never been completely taken with the Heartland theory. I know everybody who's written about Central Asia invokes Mackinder, but if you look at the actual development of history, I don't think it's been kind to Mr. Mackinder. The testamentary theory is reality. So, I mean, it was an audacious attempt back then, and there's some substantial merit to it, but I don't think I think it's been overused, and it's not altogether correct. I think there are valuable insights, but it doesn't hold up as a complete theory. And I think that people who are guided by it run aground on the shores of excessive geopolitical fascination. Now, in terms of the concluding remarks, there's no doubt that Central Asia is about to enter a new period, as I suggested. I think that the initial phase of that period, which we're seeing now, is going to unfortunately be a violent one in Afghanistan. I think also between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And quite frankly, as long as the other major issues, Indo-Pakistani rivalry, Russia-China efforts to suppress dissent, Chinese genocide in Xinjiang continue, these factors are going to make it very difficult to bring about an overall peace in Central Asia. Some places may have security, peace, and more advance towards some broad general level of prosperity. But I think Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Afghanistan are going to be very troubled areas. I think the Indo-Pakistani border will again be tense. It's not going to go away, as we have seen. Neither will the Indo-Chinese rivalry, which is much greater now after last year's events, go away. And that's going to influence a great deal of what's going on in Central Asia. So while I think one chapter is ended with the United States leaving, the next chapter is one that I don't think is necessarily going to be peaceful, but it's going to be more purely Asiatic. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I can't.
We can't hear you, Soham.
We can't hear you.
Hello? Yeah. Oh, sorry. So I was unmuted. Okay. So I said thank you to Professor Blank, and I invite Professor Ziegler to make his 2-minute concluding remark.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this. It's been very interesting. I do apologize again for coming in late. I think I got the wrong link to start with.
Me too.
I like to be optimistic on events, but I'd have to agree with Professor Blank that there is, I think, reason for pessimism in looking at Afghanistan and how that's going to impact Central Asia in the near future, at least. I mean, the country has been through more than 40 years of civil war and occupation. And I don't see any real agreement coming out between the Taliban and the government. Listening to all this reminds me of a work Amy Chua at Yale has done about tribalism. She's really on point when she talks about not just domestic politics being tribalist, which it is increasingly, I think, in this world, in many, many different countries, but in foreign policy, and that the U.S. often does not understand how people divide into tribal groups, whether they are partisan. I mean, in the U.S. now, it's between Democrats and Republicans, very, very deep divides. The populace versus elite, tribal identity, if you will. And certainly if you look at Afghanistan and Central Asia, much of what all of my colleagues have said relates to this tribalism. And I think much of what we have to do here is address these deep divisions. And since this is sponsored by an Indian organization, I would say that India, as the most diverse country in the world, which has still been able to maintain a democracy, even with the religious divisions that you have and the ethnic divisions and linguistic. I understand that India is not a perfect democracy. No country is, but it seems like you have something to offer Central Asia in terms of how to deal with these deep divisions that we see. And I think that would be the key to eventually achieving stability in the region. Finally, just to say this, it's much also depends on the great powers. Do they foment and strengthen these tribal divisions, or do they actually work to overcome them? I would hope it would be the latter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ziegler. Thank you for being here with us. I now come to Professor Andrei Kazanschev to make his remarks.
I also apologize for late coming, and it was the same situation with my friend Charles. Wrong link. However, I would also like to support his, I would say, even philosophical conclusion to this. I would not describe the situation as growth of different tribal conflicts, but I mean that generally the growth of conflicts there is everywhere. I mean geopolitical, domestic, etc. And unfortunately, in this situation of growing conflicts, we can forget about Central Asia and Afghanistan. And if we do that, we will pay. Every one of us will pay. Probably Russia, India, and China will pay most. Europe will pay less. USA will probably pay even less than Europe. But finally, it would also come to US territory. You remember it's in 9/11. So we should not forget about that. So this part of the world is usually considered as remote, too far away, and people in the world are usually uninterested in what is going on there. But if we forget about that, we should pay for that. And we will pay for that because, I mean, that rapid deterioration of the situation in this region, it will influence everyone. It will add to Indian-Pakistani issues. It will add to Xinjiang issue in China. It will add to many issues in Russia, etc. And therefore, we should build up awareness in our governments, in press, among populations, etc., that we should cooperate on these issues. Even if Russia and USA, Russia and Pakistan, etc., do not have many common views on many issues, still we should cooperate on this issue, I think, because otherwise, I return to my main message, we will pay for that, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Professor Kazanschev. Thank you to all the speakers who joined us at this technical or analytical session at the International Seminar on Central Asia, Vision for Peace, Partnership and Development, organized by the Tillotoma Foundation. I thank you so much.